So Bo Bennet, PhD, the guy who wrote the book with the chapter dedicated to criticizing Name the Trait, has cucked out of debate, as I expected, and produced a written response to my video. Now, I don't want to encourage his text cuckery by replying to the entire response here, so I'm going to reply to a segment of it where he talks about dualism, and show you just how basic and how numerous the errors are that he's making here. And you can make some kind of induction based on how error-laden this segment about dualism is, about how error-laden the overall written response is likely to be. And of course, Bo, if you want to, defend or press me on some of the other errors that you're doubling down on in this silly written response, I'm happy to do that live. I'm confident not only that I can resist your criticism, but that I can push you into a corner and make you either just sit there clinging to these delusional ideas looking like a complete moron, or concede that you are not correct in your criticism. So the verbal debate offer remains open. We will have a civil conversation and see just who's making sense here. I think it's the least you can do when you write a chapter of a book dedicated to criticizing my argument. Thank you, Bo. I await your reply. Now with that said, let's examine this segment about dualism. Bo writes, "Dualism. I wrote, if one is a dualist, they believe that the mind can exist independent of the physical brain, biological or artificial, as in some advanced AI. Ask Yourself says, he, Bo, claims that the dualist believes the mind can exist without the brain. Then Ask Yourself claims this is false. Clearly, this is not false. Okay, Bo, well, any legitimate philosophical resource is going to disagree with your claim that if one is a dualist, they believe the mind can exist without the brain. I challenge you to find a single legitimate philosophical resource that makes that claim. Let's see what kind of claims they do make. Let's check out the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a peer-reviewed academic resource, and see what they have to say about dualism. Dualism and the mind. Dualists in the philosophy of mind emphasize the radical difference between mind and matter. They all deny that the mind is the same as the brain, and some deny that the mind is wholly a product of the brain. They also believe that the mind can exist without the... Oh, wait, it doesn't say that, does it? Dualism is just the belief that the mind and the brain are different kinds of things. It is not true that if one is a dualist, they believe that the mind can exist without the brain. One can be a dualist and have that belief, but it's not the case that if one is a dualist, that is what they believe. You are simply wrong. Find a single legitimate philosophical resource that agrees with you, or admit that you're wrong. It's not that hard. And since we're talking to the fallacy man himself, let's put a label on the fallacy Bo's committing here. This is a straw man of dualism. All right, moving on. Bo writes, ask any religious person you know if God has a physical brain, and they will tell you no. Ask them if people in heaven have physical brains, and they will tell you no. Ask ghost believers if ghosts have physical brains, and they will tell you no. Well, this is just an obvious example of a false generalization. Dualists are not comprised entirely of religious people or ghost believers, so even if something were true of all religious people or all ghost believers, this would not mean that it's true of all dualists. Moving on, Bo writes, Ask Yourself is confusing can with must. If I were to claim that the dualist believes that the mind must exist independent of the physical brain, then I would have been wrong. But I didn't, so I'm not. Well, that's some incredibly silly reasoning. Why would you say, but I didn't, so I'm not? Just because you didn't make a particular error doesn't mean you're not wrong at all, right? It's possible that you made a different error. Wow, crazy. So in this case, yes, you did not say that if one is a dualist, one believes the mind must exist without the brain. You said, if one is a dualist, one believes the mind can exist without the brain. Well, guess what? Both of those sentences are wrong. You can be a dualist without believing either of those things. You could be a dualist who thinks that the mind requires the brain to exist, but nonetheless is a different kind of thing than the brain. Maybe the brain is a physical object and the mind is non-physical. Continuing, Bo writes, Ask Yourself then goes on to say, a dualist must believe that the mind and brain are separate substances. It could still be that one depend on the other. This doesn't matter if it is true or not. It's not, as it also applies to monists. Now, this is just hilarious. I'm sure at this point the philosophy people in my audience are just laughing. Bo is displaying his utter lack of comprehension of the topic. A tiny correction, I shouldn't have said substances, I should have said kinds of things, and obviously that's because there are subtypes of dualism about the mind. So on substance dualism, the mind and the brain are separate kinds of things. Again, that's the uniting factor about dualism about the mind, but both are substances. On property dualism, the mind and the brain are separate kinds of things. Again, that's the unifying factor about dualism about the mind. But one is a substance and the other is a property. So I should have said kinds of things, not substances. Now, Bo thinks that it's possible to be a monist and believe that the mind and the brain are separate substances. Well, guess what, Bo? You are delusional, okay? That position, that the mind and the brain are separate substances, is a well-established form of dualism called substance dualism. Go read about it. It is not compatible with monism. That would entail the contradiction that it is and is not the case that the mind and brain are separate substances. You do not know what you are talking about. Bo continues to say, what does matter in this section on mind games is that unless one brings magic into the equation, the mind cannot be separated from the brain. Well, that is just false, okay? So we can create a possible world where the mind exists, the brain exists, they are separate from each other, and magic doesn't exist. Show me how that situation entails a contradiction, or don't tell me that we can't create such situations. It's perfectly logically possible. Most likely you're confusing physical possibility and logical possibility again. Okay, continuing, Bo writes, I wrote, no matter how one tries to sell it, non-human animals with human minds cannot exist in this world any more than a non-round circle can exist. Ask Yourself objected to my use of a logical impossibility, the non-round circle, to compare it to what he calls my physical impossibility example, a human mind in a pig. I maintain that this is a logical impossibility because it is logically impossible to have a human mind in a non-human being, because the mind is a product of the biology. The non-human biology would make the mind non-human, because something cannot be both human and non-human at the same time. This violates the logical law of non-contradiction. So what Bo's doing is he's taking a selective definition of the human mind, where the thing that makes the mind human isn't its actual subjective character, but it's the shell around that mind, the human shell, in addition to the mind. So obviously, Bo, a charitable interpretation of what I'm saying is the identical subjective experience to a human. We're not saying that a being is simultaneously a human and not a human, or a non-human animal and not a non-human animal. We're talking about a non-human animal that has a subjective experience, a mind, right? That's what I'm referring to as the mind. Most people don't define the mind as involving the body. That's a hilarious step. We're talking about a non-human animal that has a subjective experience identical to a human. That does not create a logical contradiction. If you think it does, please derive the contradiction from the propositions being A is a non-human animal and being A has a mind that is subjectively identical to a human. You're not going to be able to. All right, so this should have demonstrated just how clueless Bo Bennet, PhD, is when he talks about pretty much anything name the trait related. Bo, again, the debate challenge remains on the table. I wait to hear from you so that we can have a proper discussion and see who's really making sense here. That's all for today. If you guys like this kind of content, support on Patreon, buy merch on Teespring. Until next time.